The following podcast contains explicit language.
Hi, I'm Stefan Fatsis, and this is Slate's sports podcast, Hang Up and Listen, for the week of December 4th, 2017. On this week's show, Howard Bryant of ESPN and Jeremy Stahl of Slate will be here to discuss the rift among National Football League players over the league's plan to donate money to social justice causes and potentially silence the player protest movement. Tom Haberstroh of Bleacher Report will join us to examine the latest craze in the National Basketball Association. Everybody's going vegan. Finally, the New York Giants on Sunday became the last NFL team to start a black quarterback. I'll deliver an extended Afterball about the first black quarterback signed by the team in 1967. And then talk with Lewis Moore, a professor at Grand Valley State University who studies African American and sports history. Josh Levine is the editorial director of Slate Magazine. He's off this week. Through the magic of pre-recording, you will, however, hear him talk about basketball veganism. And I will now take advantage of my alone time to report that at a Scrabble tournament in New York over the weekend, I scored 614 points in one game. Yes, that was a personal best. Hand clap. My bingos weren't flashy. Buggier, trustier, climate, and yodelers, plus Zaire for 68 points. Zaire's defined as a former monetary unit of Zaire. Bunch of other high scores, including a play that, among other things, turned bijou, B-I-J-O-U, into bijou, B-I-J-O-U-X for 40 points. I'll hang up and listen to your congratulations. After a round of negotiations with a group of players, the NFL last week agreed to donate $89 million over 7 years to various minority or social causes. That seemed like a positive outcome to a year of protests that were begun by San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick. That is, until details emerged. Kaepernick's former teammate Eric Reid and a couple of other players announced that they had split from the group that was negotiating with NFL management. Slate's Jeremy Stahl reported that Reid was asked as part of that deal if he would stop kneeling during the national anthem. And then Reid told Stahl in an interview that to pay for the new campaign, the NFL would shift money that was already pledged to other charitable efforts. Jeremy Stahl is here now. Hey, Jeremy.
Hi, Stefan. How are you?
Good. And so is ESPN columnist Howard Bryant. His new book, The Heritage, Black Athletes, A Divided America, and the Politics of Patriotism, will be published in May. Hey, Howard.
How are you?
Jeremy, in your interview with Eric Reid, he called this agreement a charade. Explain how the communications and the cooperation among these players fell apart.
So Eric has been working with a group called the Players Coalition, which struck this deal with the league that was announced last week. Malcolm Jenkins and Anquan Boldin are both at the head of that group. And Eric and a number of other players split from the group because of a number of issues they said they had with the deal. Specifically, Eric said that it was conveyed to him by Malcolm, that the league had conveyed to him that money would be potentially shifted around from other causes that the league promotes, such as breast cancer awareness and military awareness, salute to service, and that would be how some of this funding would be acquired. Another issue he had with it was the structure of how the money would be allocated, which set up this 7-5 voting proposal whereby owners would have 5 representatives in a working group that would determine allocation of funds. Players would have 5 members, and the league would have 2 members, which obviously then would give the league and ownership a 7-5 vote in determining how money would be set up. And he kind of emphasized to me that he really just wanted to pause the brakes on the deal before it was announced, and that Malcolm Jenkins and the league, according to him, seemed to be insistent that it move forward at this time. He was also asked, as you mentioned, would you quit protesting if this deal went through? And that was a non-starter for him.
You know, Howard, and that's what, like, my hair stood on end when I read this. I can't see this as anything but a cynical attempt by the league to get this protest movement to end.
There's no question about all of this that when the league votes on this on the 13th, I have a hard time believing that the NFL is going to agree to give the players $7 million and still have the protest going on. Somebody in that room is going to say, "Why are we giving these guys all this money if they're still going to protest?" So I think what the end game here is the real triangulation. So the players are going to get some form of money, whether it's shifting ad revenue, whether it's real dollars, a combination of the two. Then the league is going to come in and they're going to rewrite their rules about protest before the anthem or during the anthem. So therefore, the Eric Reid faction of this group is going to be isolated. They're going to be exposed. So the players are going to get the money, but Reid and company aren't going to be allowed to protest, and they're not part of the coalition either. And I think that's really sort of the NFL's way of putting an end to this thing, even though that's not going to work.
I mean, the NFL is a $14 billion industry. It beggars belief and credulity that they couldn't just do this, like find an agreeable way. Why does it always, and maybe I'm just being naive and Pollyanna-ish here, but why does it always have to be a quid pro quo? Why can't this just be, we believe that this is a worthwhile cause. We also respect the rights of our players to express themselves. We're willing to take the risks that some of our fan base doesn't agree with us, but we support the players in these efforts.
Well, that would require courage, and there's not a whole lot of that. And also, I'm not sure how worthy a cause they think it is. And 3, which is actually number 1, they're not partners. The NFL, Major League Baseball's contracts are guaranteed. The NBA's contracts are guaranteed. The NBA really does view, and you can hear how LeBron James codes it in his language when he refers to the game as our game, our sport. He doesn't call it basketball, and he doesn't call the owners owners. He calls the owners by their first names. The NBA believes in partnership, even if it's not exactly partnership. The NFL makes it very, very clear, next man up. You are not in the room with us. And so I think that's the biggest reason why they just don't do this, because I don't think that the league has ever viewed the players as a group that needed, to be in the room or that deserved that sort of equity. It's not going to happen that way. It never has.
Jeremy, in your conversations with Eric Reid and others, did you get the sense that they feel this way, that there's a recognition on their part, like, we got to fight this on our own terms because dealing with the league has never, and it doesn't look like now, that it is going to be equitable or fair?
So I want to emphasize that the proposition that Howard just made, essentially that, the league was going to use this money and this allocation of this money as a way to present cover for changing the rules in order to stifle free speech and essentially ban the protests, either by keeping players in the locker room during the national anthem, or by outright banning protests during the national anthem, is something that I put to Eric. I asked him if he thought that this was just a plan to offer cover for something done in conjunction that would ban the protests. And he said, absolutely. And that's when he said "it's a charade" quote. So yes, there is an understanding and a feeling among the players that this is not, above board.
Well, and there's one other thing that's really important, Jeremy, and once again, you've got it. And in talking with these guys, it's interesting in these types of interviews, we're all working on the same story, and we're getting bits and pieces of the same thing. And there's one gigantic piece of this that has really not been discussed, at least in any real satisfactory way, and that is the Players Association. Where is your union on this? When you're looking at Major League Baseball, for example, which is the strongest union on earth, when you look at how on earth did the National Football League Players Association allow a rift to exist between factions and allow one of those factions to negotiate with the league and and essentially have another group of the players feel sold out, especially when Eric Reid's biggest problem, if you really take stock of all the things that he said and that Russell Okunis and that a lot of the players have said, here's what they're really mad about. They're mad about the fact that the NFL has negotiated with guys who haven't put the type of skin in the game that they have. Eric Reid is on his knee every Sunday for 2 seasons, and yet Malcolm Jenkins is the leader of this group. They're not. Eric Reid's contract is up. Colin Kaepernick has not gotten a phone call from a single team this year to actually take a physical. He met with Seattle. He met with Baltimore. He's not thrown a football for anybody since the 49ers lost to the Seahawks in the last game of the season, season.
Let alone, Howard, that as the man who effectively started this and has suffered the greatest consequences, he hasn't really even been acknowledged by the NFL as a partner in these efforts.
That's part of the rift. That's a huge part of the rift here, because when they wanted to, first you had players like Michael Bennett and Eric Reid and Kenny Stills saying, well, wait a minute, how are we supposed to negotiate this deal without Colin? And then you've got the Malcolm Jenkins side of the world who are like, well, Colin said this is bigger than him. It is bigger than him. So we need something to hold in our hands. And this is one of the counter arguments to, Malcolm Jenkins wrote a letter last night about an open letter saying, I'm very insulted to be called a sellout. Here's one of the arguments in his defense. If somebody said to us, if we were having this conversation a year and a half ago, that the NFL owners would actually put real resources to this when the players started kneeling, you would laugh. So at least Malcolm Jenkins walks out of here and says, look, I got something I can hold in my hands. It may not be perfect, but I actually got money from these guys who refer to us as inmates in a prison. And so there is some value to that. On the other hand, you also look at it and you say, okay, at what cost? And is this real? One quick thing to bring up on this when you talk about the rough outlines of this deal. The players are responsible for $225,000 per team, which breaks down roughly to about either $4,200 or $5,000 per player, depending on what that dollar amount expectation is going to be. The players haven't even voted on this. So when you start looking in that room, Eric went to Troy Vincent and went to the NFL and said, look, I don't believe from canvassing the room that we can raise that kind of money. That comes down to about $5,000 per player. They may not have that kind of support, which gives the league an out to dump the whole thing, saying, look, well, we put up our end. I mean, $250,000 to an NFL owner is a drop in the bucket, but trying to go into that locker room and get $5,000 per player every year for the next 5 years, I don't know about that.
That raises an important point, which is something that Eric mentioned to me, which is that this has all been negotiated among a group of just 17 players.
Of 17
and
guys.
As far as Eric knew, just 9 in that working group were ultimately in agreement with this proposal. So you're talking about less than 1% of active rostered players.
Yeah, it's a 1,700 member union.
Come to terms with the NFL, according to Eric's understanding of these numbers, and that's just shocking.
And beyond that, when you begin to take a look at where the money initially is being earmarked, Dave Zirin does this in a column that posted this morning on The Nation, and Diana Moskovitz did a little bit of research for Deadspin. It sounds great, $89 million. Doesn't work out to that much. Over 7 years, it's about $250,000 per year per owner. Where's the money initially earmarked to go? 25% to the United Negro College Fund, 25% to the Dream Corps, which is this new activist organization that was started by Van Jones of CNN, and then 50% to the Players Coalition. But that money would then be sort of administered by something called the Hopewell Fund, as Diana Moskovitz reported, which is this nonprofit run by a former Clinton administration official. So whether this is even money that is A, substantial, or B, going to groups that are going to be doing the kind of on-the-ground work that, say, Colin Kaepernick is focused on in his donations over the last year is completely unclear, Howard.
Well, it's unclear in terms of can they actually pull this off?
Right.
But it's very clear in terms of where does the United Negro College Fund really need money right now? That's like me giving money to the Red Cross.
Zyron writes that it absolutely sounds like the first organization Jerry Jones would think of when it comes to any issue involving black people.
Exactly. And so you start looking at this and you got Cap on the ground. I mean, he's on the ground floor really dealing with organizations. Do you think that a 5-owner, 5-player, 2 NFL executive board is going to allow allocations to, say, anti-police brutality organizations that challenge some of the police that have deals with the NFL in terms of security on Sundays?
Or be able to identify real grassroots organizations that are doing small community work.
Yeah, it's going to be real difficult. And I don't know if feeling for Malcolm Jenkins is part of it, but I think that as opposed to whether it's the N-word or the Uncle Tom word, calling somebody a sellout in the black community is one of the most hurtful things you could possibly say. Do I believe that Malcolm Jenkins sold out African Americans in making this deal? Absolutely not. I really don't. I think he's a guy who's trying to get something that he can hold in his hands, trying to walk away with something to get something done. But on the other hand, in terms of the anger and the difficulties in making this deal, whether it's the union or whether it's dealing with Cap and his faction, did he hurt his own players? Yeah, absolutely. I think he did.
So I think it's important to note that, the conflicts don't just boil down to, is Colin Kaepernick involved? Who should be in charge of this? Who the leaders should be? Should it be Malcolm Jenkins? Should it be Colin? There are real issues and actual substantive differences that need to be addressed and exist between these players, and more so between the players and the league. And it's visible. Last night, I was at the ACLU's of Southern California's annual Bill of Rights dinner, and Colin Kaepernick was a surprise honoree. He received an award for courage and bravery, I think is what they called it. And he gave very, very brief remarks, which is, he hasn't done a lot of in the last year since he essentially lost his job for this protest. And he said, "We must confront systemic oppression as a doctor would a disease. You identify it, you call it out, you treat it, and you defeat it." And Eric also used the words oppression and systemic oppression in conversations with me. And if you look at the memo that the league sent owners about this proposal, it doesn't use anything resembling similar language. It talks about this group will work directly with league staff to help identify future initiatives that have broad support and potential for high impact. And it talks about unity, and it talks very generically about issues that the players care about without actually emphasizing the real and sometimes divisive issues that the players are actually protesting for.
The NFL isn't in the business of being an activist. The NFL is in the business of looking good.
Well, Stefan, that's an interesting point.
How do you get to a place where the NFL can even be part of any sort of conversation or solution?
The players have created a great platform with these protests that, to me, it could be argued is worth well more than $89 million.
That is one of the great questions. The Major League Baseball Players Association had their board meeting this past week in Dallas, and everybody's trying to figure out where they fit in this question of social activism and platform against these gigantic corporate interests, because Major League Baseball is a $10 billion industry. And one of the things that Tony Clark, the executive director, said to me was, are we a social institution or aren't we? We take public money for our stadiums. We have all kinds of different charity or charitable initiatives in terms of the United Way and the NBA Cares and Major League Baseball and all of these different things. Are we a social institution? And if we are, then we need to live up to that. And I think that's one of the things that the NFL players are doing. They're saying, look, if we're going to have the military on the field, if we're going to honor police, if you're going to have a league that's got 70% or 68%, 68% black workforce, you're going to have to pay attention to issues that are important to us and live up to being the social institution that you say you are. And it's very interesting that the pushback along those lines hasn't come from the owners nearly as much as it has come from the fans who just want football. They don't want that social stuff because they necessarily don't believe it themselves. It's where we are right now. And who could have thought that 5 or 10 years ago?
Howard Bryant is a columnist for ESPN, a commentator for NPR. He's the author of a new book. It's called The Heritage, Black Athletes, A Divided America, and the Politics of Patriotism. You can pre-order it now. Howard, thanks.
My pleasure.
Jeremy Stahl is a senior editor at Slate. Jeremy, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, guys.
Before we get to NBA vegans, a heads up that on our bonus segment for Slate Plus members this week, Howard Bryant is going to stick around. We'll talk some baseball. Where will Shohei Ohtani wind up? Why is Aaron Boone becoming manager of the New York Yankees? What will become of Giancarlo Stanton? If you want to hear that conversation, please join Slate Plus for just $35 a year. If you do, you can get a Slate tote bag plus bonus segments on this and other Slate podcasts every week. Sign up at slate.com/hangupplus.
The slowest NBA team in 2017 plays at a faster pace than the fastest team in the league did 2 decades ago. Perhaps as a consequence of the league's recent Jones for Speed, players are getting skinnier now, with the Harvard Sports Analysis Collective finding that the average weight of an NBA player has gone down by 3 pounds in the last 4 years. It's certainly easy to find examples of players talking about wanting to lose weight. Here's ESPN's Chauncey Billups asking the Celtics' Kyrie Irving about his svelte figure.
I know you shaved that beard this summer, man, but I'm telling you, you're looking in great shape right now. Have you lost weight, man, to get ready for the season?
Well, this season, being more of a plant-based diet, getting away from, just the animals and all that, man. I had to get away from that. So my energy is up. My body feels amazing. So, just understanding what the diet is like for me and what's beneficial for me for having the highest energy out here and being able to sustain it at a very high level.
As you heard there, Kyrie is getting away from the animals. He's gotten away from dairy, too. As Tom Haberstroh wrote in a feature for Bleacher Report magazine, Damian Lillard and Wilson Chandler and a bunch of other NBA players have embraced veganism as well. And not just because drinking tart cherry juice before bed every night makes for a delicious nighttime experience. Joining us now to discuss is Tom Haberstroh. He's a writer at large for Bleacher Report magazine and one of the proprietors of the Basketball Friends podcast. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
So I tried to make a connection between the league being faster, players being skinnier, and this seeming like micro trend of players going vegan. Do you feel like that is a fair connection to make, that players like Kyrie Irving, Damian Lillard, Wilson Chandler, and others that we'll get into are embracing this diet because the league is faster and players are skinnier?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a big enough sample to say 8 or 10 or a dozen players have totally shifted the league's pace. But I will say that generally speaking, it is so hard to get by in today's NBA where the pace is so fast and just the actual play calling is so much more sophisticated. Defenses are they have rotations on top of rotations that if you're not fit, if you're not healthy, if you're not taking care of your body at 100% of the time, you're going to get washed out really fast. And I think this is one of the signals of that. So it's not just Kyrie Irving or Damian Lillard. It's guys like Wilson Chandler, Enes Kanter of the New York Knicks. These guys have slimmed down in the offseason in hopes to get quicker and faster and alleviate, joint pain. Wilson Chandler, for example, said he feels so much better after 2 hip surgeries and trimming his diet to a vegan diet. He thinks this is permanent.
The NBA has always been fast and competitive. Were players that much out of shape? And it's always also been an incredibly absurd grind. I mean, these are 6 foot to 7 foot human beings who are jamming themselves into airplanes and flying all over the country constantly. We've talked about other aspects of physical conditioning that have evolved over the years, and that can be sleep, training, other aspects of nutrition. Why has the league gotten faster, and what other responses to it seem logical to you? And I guess the follow-up to that is how much of this might be a placebo effect, that players feel like this is a smart thing to do, and maybe the results are, yeah, they're positive because we'd all benefit from eating better. But whether we could attribute that much gain in performance to a switch in diet, I wonder. I guess whatever advantage you can get, right?
I talked to the Atlanta Hawks nutritionist about this whole vegan thing, and she's like, obviously you feel better. You cut out Cheetos and, fried chicken,
Sure.
You obviously are going to feel better cutting out those fried foods. So it's not maybe the case that you're performing better because you're having those lettuce wrap vegan tacos. It might be that you're just opting for those instead of, trash food. So junk food. So there's a lot of placebo effect potential on this for sure. And also just generally, if you lose weight, you might feel lighter. But the case might be that you're not going to be able to sustain this for the 82-game slog. And I think a lot of the trainers and nutritionists that I talked to had a lot of skepticism of whether they could hold this up over the entire seasons. And I think one reason you're seeing it now is the What the Health documentary from this summer. Garrett Temple, who's the starting guard for the Sacramento Kings, watched it this summer, as well as many other NBA players, and they got spooked. It's a pro-vegan, almost radical, extremist vegan documentary. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's pretty strong. And so I think a lot of the players who, by the way, are on airplanes and in hotels late at night with not much to do, they watch these Netflix documentaries, and I think a lot of them got spooked and decided to look at their diets.
I'm really glad that you brought up this Netflix documentary, What the Health, because that was the thing that was really most striking to me in the story. This is a story about diet and about veganism, but it's also a story about how trends spread in the NBA and elsewhere. And I haven't seen this documentary, but based on what I've read, the scientific term for this movie is like garbage propaganda. Vox had a good story on some of the claims in this movie, like eating processed meats is as bad for you as smoking, and eating an egg a day is as bad as smoking 5 cigarettes. Drinking milk causes cancer. I mean, this is all just wrong and dumb, but it's presented in this like extremely persuasive way, and players, Garrett Temple is known as one of the smartest and most thoughtful players in the NBA. I followed him for a really long time, like crazily intelligent guy, like is known for that in NBA circles. The fact that he would be persuaded by this movie is like really interesting to me. But I think that means that like any smart person or like lots of smart people would be susceptible to stuff like this. But I guess it's just particularly interesting to me that NBA players whose entire careers are based on their bodies and knowing what should be put into them and like understanding diet would like watch this and be like, oh, I've totally got to be vegan now and not check out the claims from the movie.
And I'm going to jump in here and say that this is sort of reflective of the way sports operate generally. Sports are very trend-based, right? So whether it's players seeing a documentary and deciding to join a cause, or general managers focusing in on a particular kind of player, whether it's length in the NBA right now or speed on the court, possessions are up per game, as you point out in the story. Speed is a trend. Or in football, whether it's a particular style of offense or defense that's predominant at a particular time. These are sort of closed societies, and they're very small, and we underestimate how small and interconnected they are.
One last thing before Tom jumps in, and I should add that like going vegan is not a bad thing, and it might be that these players are like doing a good thing for their health, but just doing it based on bad information.
I mean, it's so true. The NBA is a copycat league. The Golden State Warriors won a championship in 2015, and then suddenly everyone's taking transition threes, and not everyone has Steph Curry on their team. So even though this is a story about veganism, you're right that the big picture here is players are using cryotherapy chambers, freezing their bodies after games. They're eating differently after games. They're sleeping. Like, I think we kind of forget that these guys are basically living with each other. These 15 guys are living with each other and sleeping with each other. The idea is they relate to each other on a whole nother level. I mean, they're basically cooped up together for 6 months, seeing more of each other than their families. And And it just kind of is contagious, this idea of like, hey, you're playing really well late in games. What is it? Oh, man, I changed my diet. I feel great. You should try it out. I mean, it's not for everyone, but you should try it. And like Jaylen Brown for the Boston Celtics, he was a vegetarian in college in California, and his goal is to be vegan by 25. He's 23 years old right now, and he looks at Kyrie Irving. He's like, man, I want to look like that in late game situations. Like, I want to do that. And so I think there's a lot of that going on, which is if Kyrie Irving was stinking up the joint this season and the Celtics were in the tank, I don't know if the vegan story is going to be that big. But now that everyone who seems to be going with this diet or getting away from meats, a bunch of them are performing well so far. I think there is just some sort of momentum and some, eyebrow raising around the league is like, okay, what is it about this that maybe is true? Maybe it's not about veganism, but what if we can have some takeaways just about the overall diet of our NBA players?
It is certainly an underappreciated fact that sports leagues are like cults, and I think that's what you were kind of alluding to. These players are cooped up. They are hostages. They are hostages to the system and to their training schedules.
And to Netflix.
So it never surprises me when there's a trend like this in pro sports. Back to the correlation causation issue here. With Kyrie Irving, I mean, the numbers that you use in the story are pretty damn dramatic. The speed part particularly, you point out that Kyrie's average speed has increased by 0.3 of a mile per hour, 26 feet of extra ground per minute on the floor. And then when you put it in those terms, you sort of recognize, like, it's probably imperceptible to most of us when we watch an NBA game, but the underlying statistics do show, don't they, Tom, that, there's a lot more ground being covered and players are out there.
But wait, isn't that because he's trying on defense?
Well, it might be for him,
but
if it's also up across the league, then it does show that the game is faster. And there's
I think there's no doubt that the game is faster, and I think I mentioned that in the story that it's not just the sheer raw miles per hour gain; it's the acceleration year over year ranking among the rest of the league is second highest. So Kyrie Irving has been generally known as a dog defensively, and I talked to his former GM David Griffin there for Cleveland, who was part of the Cleveland staff when they drafted him, and they won a title together in Cleveland. And David Griffin was like, whatever Kyrie Irving wants to do, he will do. And so he could absolutely be Gary Payton defensively if he wanted to. He just has to put his mind to it. He's that talented. And he pointed to his finals play against Steph Curry in 2016. Just defensively, if he really wants to grind it, he can do it. And this year, he's among the league leaders in steals and deflections, and the Celtics defense is number one in the NBA. Part of that activity by Kyrie Irving is leading to real on-court results. So maybe that's just, he's trying defensively, but look, guys, we'd like to try and go out and run 5 miles every other day, but it's another thing to actually do it. And I think part of the reason that Kyrie Irving is able to try defensively may be because he's kind of looked at his entire inputs. What is he eating? How is he sleeping? Because now he wants to maximize both ends of the floor for Brad Stevens.
Let's end with kind of taxonomizing or categorizing this trend, because I do like to think of it as a trend or a social contagion. It's funny, like one of the other ones that comes to mind is players eating at the Cheesecake Factory. That's like a known thing that NBA players are obsessed with it. Another one that came up earlier this year, I forget who did the story. Maybe it was Baxter Holmes on players eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That being another trend that was big in the NBA. There's also the Versa Climber, this piece of exercise equipment that LeBron James really touted, and now every team and every player uses it. Are there other ones that I'm forgetting, Tom?
Yeah, there was one last year I wrote about strobe light glasses. Have you heard about these?
No. Missed that.
And don't laugh. There's actual real players like Kawhi Leonard, Steph Curry, and even Michael Jordan. I wrote it last year for ESPN.com. Strobe light glasses worn by a bunch of star players. They're it's hard to explain without actually seeing it, but it's glasses you put on your face that blind your vision like a strobe light. And so when you do basketball drills with these glasses on and then you take them off after 10 minutes, the world seems to slow down. And so for Steph Curry and Kawhi Leonard, their ability to play in the open court and just be dominant in the open court, a lot of this, their trainers used strobe light glasses to improve. So it's crazy.
Our producer was just showing us a video of Steph, like with the glasses on, dribbling a basketball and a tennis ball simultaneously, like kind of looking like Ray Charles. It's very compelling video.
So that's another trend, is just like they wear glasses, they eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. There was the Tinderization of the NBA story I did last year,
right.
Which is, guys were sleeping more on the road because these apps were allowing them to find companionship, to put it lightly, to find companionship on the road a lot more efficiently. Instead of going to the bars late at night and trying to find women that way, they just have it pretty much Uberized in their hotel. And so a lot of this is just becoming, these trends in society, just technology and food, nutrition, sleep. I love writing these stories because it isn't really about the NBA. It's just about people in general, learning to live in 2017. And we just see it, being played out on the court with wins and losses with basketball players.
Tom Haberstroh is a writer at large for Bleacher Report magazine. He also is a part of the Basketball Friends podcast. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
In 1920, a black man, Fritz Pollard, played what was effectively quarterback for the Akron Pros of the American Professional Football Association. 5 years after that, the New York Giants joined what had become the National Football League. And 97 years later, on Sunday, the Giants started a black quarterback for the first time. But Geno Smith wasn't the first black quarterback in Giants history. That would be Hank Washington. Washington was a 6'3", 215-pound pocket passer who in 1966, as a senior at West Texas State University, threw for more than 2,100 yards, fifth in the country, including 470 in one game. He was the first black quarterback to play in the North-South Shrine Game and in the Senior Bowl, both of which were held in Alabama. He once said he had thrown a ball 95 yards in the air. Some draft reports listed Washington among the year's top quarterback prospects, alongside Steve Spurrier of Florida, Bob Greasy of Purdue, and Don Horn of San Diego State, who were selected 3rd, 4th, and 25th in the draft. There were 420 more players selected by the NFL's 21 teams in the 17 rounds of the 1967 draft. Hank Washington wasn't one of them. Bill Nunn Jr. of the black newspaper The Pittsburgh Courier wrote at the time, "Some teams drafted soccer players, others went for basketball stars, still others grabbed individuals who had performed in track." Nunn wrote, "In your case, Hank Washington, there is no doubt that you have become a victim of your color." Black men just didn't play quarterback in the NFL. Fritz Pollard predated the actual league, and he was more of a runner than a passer, as were Joe Lillard, who started for the Chicago Cardinals in 1932, and George Taliaferro, who started for the Baltimore Colts in 1953. Two black quarterbacks were drafted in the 1950s. One of them was Bernie Custis, whom Josh talked about on the podcast last week, and a couple had played in the regular season. The aptly named Willie Thrower threw 8 passes in one game for the Bears in 1953, and Charlie Brackens threw 2 passes for the Packers in 1955. But no black quarterback had started a game in the modern NFL. The Giants signed Hank Washington in April 1967. The New York Times put the news on the front of its sports section. Here's the lead of the story by Gerald Eskenazi. The football giants have signed a Negro quarterback who had been passed up by every club in the recent professional draft because he was reported to have been, quote, too cocky, end quote. Eskenazi quoted an unnamed scout who said, "The kid has been cocky all through school. He has always said he won't play anywhere but quarterback." Aha! Washington was a black quarterback who wanted to play quarterback. No matter how many yards they amassed in college, black men were considered ill-equipped to play quarterback in the NFL. Eskenazi quoted Giants owner Wellington Mara saying the team only signed Washington after he had, quote, repudiated the statement that he would only play quarterback, end quote. Mara said Washington had a chance to play as a receiver or as a defensive back. The Giants did actually draft a black quarterback that year, Dave Lewis of Stanford, in the 5th round, but they drafted him as a punter. Lewis chose to play in Canada. So how exactly was Hank Washington cocky? The unnamed scout claimed that other teams were going to take him in the 1st or 2nd round of the draft, but then he started talking big. The scout quoted Washington saying that he was as good as Spurrier and Greasy, and the only team that he couldn't play for was the Miami Dolphins, but only because the coach's son, George Wilson, was the starter. Washington denied saying those things. Quote, maybe I was the victim of newspaper stories saying how great I was, he said after the draft. They exaggerated a bit and possibly scared some teams off, thinking my price would be too high. Regardless, you'd think a team might actually want a player, especially a quarterback, who believed in his ability. But not a black player, not a few weeks before Muhammad Ali would refuse induction into the Army, and a few months before race riots would engulf Detroit, Newark, and other cities. Cocky, black, and quarterback wasn't happening. The perception that Hank Washington was anything but deferential was reason enough not to draft him. Still, the Giants gave Washington $40,000, a lot for an undrafted free agent. The team didn't expect him to compete for the starting job. New York had just traded 4 top picks to the Minnesota Vikings for Fran Tarkenton, and they had a veteran backup in Earl Morrall. So why did they sign him? Because then as now, teams wanted talent. I suspect that Wellington Mara's protestation that Washington was better suited to be a position player was part racial stereotyping and part public relations. The team knew he was good because one of its assistant coaches, Emlyn Tunnell, had been scouting Washington for 2 years. Tunnell was a standout defensive back for the Giants and the Green Bay Packers from 1948 to 1961. He also was the first African-American player on the Giants, and just a few weeks before the team signed Hank Washington, he became the first black player inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Let's contrast Eskenazi's reporting in the Times with a story in the Philadelphia Tribune, that city's black newspaper. Rather than relying on an anonymous, no doubt white scout to trash Washington's character, the Tribune reporter Claude E. Harrison Jr. interviewed an actual coach on the Giants, Emlyn Tunnell. Tunnell told Harrison he was surprised that Washington went undrafted because he is without a doubt one of the top pro prospects coming into the league this year. I don't know whether he'll be the first Negro pro quarterback, Tunnell said. Maybe he meant modern pro quarterback or successful modern pro quarterback. But his record as a college player is too outstanding to overlook. Unlike Mara, who had to emphasize that Washington was likelier to make the team as a receiver or a defensive back, black positions, Tunnell said the Giants will give him every possible opportunity to survive as a quarterback. Our job is to put together a winner, and if Washington shows he has the ability to do a job, he plays. Tunnell called Washington a smart kid. He'll show up at camp ready to play. And if he does 75% of what I know he's capable of doing, you'll see him at Yankee Stadium when the 1967 season gets underway. Giants fans did not see Hank Washington in the Bronx. Though he apparently did well in training camp, Allie Sherman, the coach, said he had fine potential as a quarterback. He was sent to the Giants' minor league team, the Westchester Bulls, who played in Mount Vernon just outside of the city. The GM of that team, a former Giants player, said Washington was a clean-cut kid and a hard worker. So much for cocky. Washington played the entire season with the Bulls, alternating with an older quarterback. He returned to Giants camp in 1968, but again was sent to Westchester, where he threw for 4 touchdowns in one game, but was inconsistent overall. In 1969, Washington joined another minor league team in Hartford, Connecticut. The following year, he fell ill and was diagnosed with bladder cancer. Hank Washington died in 1971 at the age of 25. I stumbled across the story of Hank Washington in the Twitter feed of Lewis Moore. He's an associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Moore is the author of 2 just-published books, I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915, and We Will Win the Day, The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. Lewis, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. It is hard to know whether Hank Washington didn't make it with the Giants because he wasn't good enough or because he was the victim of the racial bias that governed the day. But his story really is a familiar one from that time.
Right. Familiar because he was touted as the first hope. There's other black quarterbacks before him, but I think what Hank had above them was his size and his accuracy, and he had the throwing power. So the rumor was that he could throw it 90 yards. He was one of the more efficient quarterbacks in college that year. 6'3", about 215 pounds.
Yep.
And so the black press really thought that he would be that guy. And so I think that's why it's important, right? Because if it's about merit, you find the first guy that's going to fit this mold. There's no way you can turn him down. And then, as you mentioned, he goes undrafted.
Right. And then the thing about him was, like, you couldn't deny that this guy was a prototypical quarterback. Size, skill, strength, ability, statistics. This wasn't like, he's only 5'11", or he's only 185 pounds. He'd be better off playing defensive back or wide receiver. This was sort of undeniable that this guy had to play quarterback. And still, you had, as I mentioned in my piece, the owner of the Giants saying that he's more likely to make the team if he's a defensive back or a wide receiver.
Right, and I think that's where that question about was this about race comes in, because I think, those owners at that time, the GMs, the coaches, the scouts, they couldn't see past that, right? And so I don't think when you talk about black quarterbacks, even to this day, there's no really race-neutral conversation because it's so rooted in that idea that can he be a leader, can he think, can he make these throws? And still, like you said, they're like, well, you can't sign this exclusive contract where you're only going to get a tryout for quarterback. You're going to have to, change your mind and be up to playing DB or receiver where they all went before him. So very few got to throw passes, and that's a shame because a lot of them were great in college.
And you said, a lot of black men did play quarterback in college, and usually they had to declare in advance, which is something Hank Washington wasn't willing to do, that they wanted to play another position. I don't think that we appreciate, the other side of the story, which is just how pernicious this glass ceiling was, because every time a black man or a black kid played quarterback in high school or college, it mattered in the black community, right?
Yeah, and it mattered. And when we say college, there's two types, right? There's the HBCUs, there's the black colleges, and then there's the PWI, the predominantly white institutions. Mm-hmm. And they both mattered. And I think Hank Washington's story is more amplified because he went to an integrated school in the South. So, if you're going to say, well, they don't have leadership skills or a white player won't take, instruction for him, well, Hank proved otherwise. And so same thing with the Big Ten quarterbacks. Like Sid Williams, who played at Wisconsin in 1957 he's from Little Rock. And so while everything's going down in Little Rock, the National Guard is making sure that these 9 students could get into this school, he's starring at Wisconsin. And people are looking at him and saying, look, if he could star here, then integration at these southern schools shouldn't be a problem. So you're projecting, if you're the black community, what these guys do at these predominantly white schools and saying, like, look, integration can work.
And in Hank Washington's case, he played in those 2 All-Star games in Alabama. I mean, this sent a message. And within the black community, how was it received in the black newspapers, in the towns where these athletes came from? How was it received when they went to places like Wisconsin, to predominantly white institutions, and were not only allowed, in air quotes, to play quarterback, but performed well?
Oh, it's a huge deal. Just being at one of those schools. So the Baltimore Afro-Americans, so the main writer for them was Sam Lacy, so a Hall of Fame writer. Right. And what you start to see in the 1930s and into the 1940s is he kept a list. And so every week you would go look at, it's a weekly newspaper, and he would list and tell his readers what these guys are doing at these, predominantly white institutions, no matter what position they are. But Then when you get to like quarterbacking, especially in the late 1950s, where it seems like there's more of them, there's their count. Like, so you could look at a news, like Ebony magazine would have its annual, like, who's the black quarterback, how many are there at these schools, at these white schools, and what are their chances of making a pro. So this mattered.
What was striking to me is how executives of the 60s and into the 70s talked about black quarterback prospects. First it was like with Hank Washington and Marlon Briscoe, who started a year in 1968 for the Denver Broncos before they forced him to wide receiver, and he left and played for the Buffalo Bills. Al Davis drafted Eldridge Dickey in 1968. He said something very similar, praising Dickey, said he has great potential as a quarterback. And then the Raiders promptly moved him to wide receiver, and he was out of the league 3 years later, maybe because he would have been a better quarterback than a wide receiver. So it's that language of sort of institutionalized racism that seems to have kept some of these players from even having the opportunity to achieve their potential.
Right, and I think what's happening, too, is that there's a lot of, even though, it's on, like, black newspapers are picking this up, some of these guys are making a major coverage, right? So Eldridge Dickey, there's stuff in Sport Magazine. They're talking about him in Sports Illustrated. His nickname is the Lord's Prayer, because after Hank Washington, he becomes the next guy. Like, he's the next big thing. And I think what happens is owners are really reluctant to specifically, they can't say, well, we're going to switch him to receiver, even though that's going to happen. So they seem a little bit more open-minded about them getting a chance. And so Dickey gets a chance, a first-round draft pick. And it's clear, as you said, that he's not going to get a chance to play quarterback. He plays a little bit in the preseason, but while Davis loves his athleticism and wants to put a wide receiver, Dickey getting drafted in the first round, he's the first black quarterback to get drafted in the first round with really this idea that he'll play, was so important to the black community in the Bay Area that they were going to boycott the Oakland Raiders.
Wow.
Because he didn't get a shot. So there was talks about boycotting the Oakland Raiders because he wasn't getting his fair shot about quarterbacks. And Al Davis was saying, like, no, this is not it. I'll give him his chance. But then Al Davis also said, like, nobody's going to tell me what to do with my team. So the boycott, from what I've seen, kind of fell through, but that's how important it was to get somebody finally an opportunity to play at quarterback.
You've written a lot about black athletes during the civil rights era. What does Hank Washington's story or Eldridge Dickey's story or the stories of any number of these black quarterbacks say to you? Why are they important, and how do they fit in the evolution of the black athlete?
Well, it's like the manager. The quarterback is that next big moment that happens in the 1960s, like when you're talking about barrier breakers, right? So you have Jackie Robinson, you have Althea Gibson. You've achieved everything. You've broken out all these barriers. But at that time, you hadn't done quarterback, you hadn't done manager, you hadn't done coach. And this is really about really signifying that black people can lead, that black people have the intellect to do these things, and also that white people, white athletes, right, and white fans will accept this. And so this is the talk that you get in the 1960s from the black press. Like, this is important, right? Because it's not just about sports. It's what happens off the field. And so oftentimes you're looking at the success of the black athlete in hope that those white fans that cheer them will then, hire you for a position, right? So if we're talking about the quarterback, the coach, or the manager, it's the same thing. That okay, you're going to cheer for this guy. Well, then give me a chance at the company to lead the company, and that's why it's so important.
Lewis Moore is an associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University. He's got 2 new books out: I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1950, and We Will Win the Day, The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. Lewis, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That is our show for today. Our producer is Patrick Fort. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup. You can email us at hangup@slate.com. For Josh Levine, I'm Stefan Fatsis. Remember Zelmo Beatty and Hank Washington, and thanks for listening.